This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitahone, and in this video I'm continuing with my Outlaws of Thunder Junction set review. So far I've looked at all the multicolored, colorless, white, blue, and black cards, and today we're looking at all the red ones. For each of these cards, I'll discuss how I think they'll perform in Limited, that means Draft and Sealed, and I'll punctuate each evaluation with a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews and unsure what my letter grades mean, you can find a guide in the description. There are a few important things to keep in mind as I review these cards. First, because we're only talking about Draft and Sealed, that means we're only looking at cards in Play Boosters. Furthermore, I'm only looking at cards from the main set in this video. Play Boosters in this set also have some bonus sheets, and I'll cover those cards after we finish looking at the whole set. Second, these are my evaluations of these cards before actually playing with them, since my goal is to have this set review done for you in time for the pre-release, and that means I'll be wrong about some things. However, as the format comes into focus, I'll be doing videos where I discuss how things have panned out. Lastly, I want to let you know that there are some set review related perks for being a channel member or a patron. You get access to my ongoing set notes during preview season, and you'll also get a spreadsheet with all of my grades once a set review is complete. If those perks interest you, check out the description where you can find out how to support the channel using one of those methods. Alright, without further ado, let's dive in with a look at the red cards in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. Our first card is Brimstone Roundup, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon enchantment. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, create a 1/1 red mercenary creature token with tap, target creature you control gets +1/+0 until end of turn, activate only as a sorcery, and it has plot for 2 generic and a red. This means you can pay that cost and exile it from your hand, and then cast it at sorcery speed on a later turn without paying its mana cost, plot only as a sorcery. This does absolutely nothing on its own, and that is a big concern in Limited. Sure, you can plot it and make sure you get that first 1/1, but that still means you gave up on board development for a turn. I would love if this ended up being good, and plot gives it a chance, but I'm still pretty skeptical about an enchantment that does nothing on its own. I'm starting it at D+. Next up, it's Calamity Galloping Inferno, which for 4 generic and 2 red is a 4/6 legendary horse mount at rare. It's got haste, and when it attacks while saddled, choose a non-legendary creature that saddled it this turn and create a tapped and attacking token that's a copy of it. Sacrifice that token at the beginning of the next end step, repeat this process once, and it has Saddle 1. Saddling works a lot like crewing. You tap any number of creatures with total power 1 or more, and then this is saddled. It is always a creature, so it's not like crewing in that sense, but it does get this bonus if you're able to do that. A 6 mana 4/6 with haste is kind of underwhelming. It's probably a C. However, this is very easy to saddle, and its attack trigger is pretty nuts. Getting 2 tokens of your creature that saddled it also means sometimes it's going to be worth saddling this with something huge, but even if you're just getting extra copies of like 2/2s, that attack is going to be really scary, and because this has haste, that can come down and do it out of nowhere. This can just come down and add immense amounts of damage to the board thanks to being really easy to saddle and having haste and being able to make 2 token copies of whatever saddles it. It looks like a really, really good card. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Caught in the Crossfire, which for 2 red mana is an uncommon instant, and it has Spree, so you can choose 1 or more additional costs. You can pay 1 generic, and it does 2 damage to each outlaw creature, and you can pay 1 generic, and it does 2 damage to each non-outlaw creature. So if you pay 4 total, it does 2 damage to everything at instant speed. That's a decent rate for that effect, and it's nice that you can choose to go after or exclude outlaws too. So while it's symmetrical, you can do enough to make it benefit you that I think this is probably decent as a main deck card, giving it a C. Next up, it's Cunning Coyote, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 coyote at uncommon. It's got haste, and when it enters the battlefield, another target creature you control gets +1/+1 and gains haste until end of turn, and it has plot for 1 generic and a red. This is a great 2-drop. A 2 mana 2/2 haste is already right up red's alley, but buffing something else and giving it haste is pretty sweet. If you can double spell the turn you play this, it'll be particularly spicy, but it also means that whenever the coyote comes down, it's going to make your attack a lot better between its own haste and buffing something else. Plot is nice because sometimes you really need to play 2 creatures in a turn to make it worth it, and plot lets you do that, but this is just great on 2, and great all game long even if you don't plot it, giving it a B. Next up, it's Deadeye Duelist, which for 1 generic and a red is a 1/3 human assassin at common with reach. You can pay 1 generic and tap it, and it does 1 damage to target opponent. So this ability commits a crime, but red isn't super into committing crimes. It has a few cards that care about it, but it's blue and black that really care. Still, a 2 mana 1/3 with reach is reasonable, and the ping is cheap enough to be usable. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Demonic Ruckus, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon enchantment aura with Enchant Creature. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has Menace and Trample. When Demonic Ruckus is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, draw a card, and it has Plot for 1 red. This has me pretty interested. The Plot is super cheap, and the Ruckus also replaces itself while offering a very legitimate buff. The bad news is your opponent knows this aura is coming, and that always makes an aura worse because the risk of getting 2 for 1 is real enough that it's very dangerous to play this into your opponent having mana up, and they can just have mana up and keep you from playing it. And even if they're bluffing, you can't really take the risk. Still, this is efficient either way you play it, so I think it's worth a slot in aggressive red decks. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Discerning Peddler, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 human rogue at common. When it enters the battlefield, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. This into the battlefield is medium, and so are the stats. I think it's probably just a C-. We've seen other cards with this ability, like the 2-mana 2/1 artifact with Unearth that had that enter the battlefield ability, but it was way better because it was an artifact and because it could get the ability twice, because it had Unearth. This just doesn't get there. Next up, it's Explosive Derailment, which for 1 red mana is a common instant with Spree. You can pay 2 generic to deal 4 damage to target creature, and 2 generic to destroy an artifact. This is a great common. 3 mana to do 4 at instant speed is something I'm already signing up for, and in the later game you might also take out an artifact, and if there's a problem artifact earlier, you can also just cast this as a more expensive Shatter. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Ferocification, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon enchantment. At the beginning of combat on your turn, choose one. Target creature you control gets +2/+0 until end of turn, or target creature you control gains Menace and Haste until end of turn. We've seen many enchantments that don't add anything to the board themselves, and all that they can do is augment one of your creatures a turn, and they really only do something on your turn, and they just don't work out. Sure, these 2 modes can definitely improve your attacks, but I think most of the time you'd rather just play a 3-drop creature that can do stuff when it's on its own. Furthermore, this is entirely useless if you're not the beatdown, and that makes it miserable in many situations. I think it's a D. Next up, it's Gila Courser, which for 2 generic and a red is a 4/2 lizard-mounted uncommon. When it attacks while saddled, you exile the top card of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may play that card. It has Saddle 1. This has a solid baseline, and it won't be too hard to draw a card off of it. Your opponent will usually block and kill it when that happens, but that means you just got a 2 for 1. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Great Train Heist, which is an instant at rare for 1 red mana. It has Spree. You can pay 2 generic and a red to untap all your creatures. If it's your combat phase, there's an additional combat phase after this phase. You can pay 2 generic, and creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain first strike until end of turn. And you can pay 1 red and choose target opponent. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to that player this turn, create a tap treasure token. I'm already pretty sold on the second mode here. 2 generic and a red for +1/+0 and first strike to your whole board is a pretty big beating, as it is likely to help your creatures run over all of their blockers while chipping in extra damage. It's honestly also pretty good if you have to use it defensively. So when you add in some treasure and a potential extra combat step, which is super potent when all of your creatures have survived thanks to first strike, we're talking about a pretty good card. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Hell to Pay, which for X and a red is a rare sorcery. It deals X damage to target creature. Create a number of tapped treasure tokens equal to the amount of excess damage dealt to that creature this way. X damage spells never feel efficient, but it's always great that they scale as the game goes on. Of course, being able to point this at your opponent would help make up for that. But I'm pretty happy to get some mana back when I do too much damage to something too. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Hellspur Brute, which for 4 generic and a red is a 5/4 Minotaur Mercenary at uncommon. It has affinity for Outlaws and Trample. A 5-mana 5/4 Trampler is probably a C- at the very best these days, but I think casting this on 4 is going to happen pretty often, which is obviously far better. Additionally, in the later stages of the game, it may end up being really cheap with all the mercenary tokens. Maybe it helps you trigger a double spell thing. I think that makes this a C overall. Next up, it's Hellspur Posse Boss, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a 2/4 Lizard Rogue at rare. Other outlaws you control have haste, and when it enters the battlefield, you create 2 1/1 red mercenary creature tokens. A 4-mana 2/4 that makes 2 1/1s is already a great card. So the fact those 1/1s will also have haste, which not only means they can attack right away, it means you can also choose to use their abilities. And that matters because it means they're way more flexible. Like, you don't always want to attack with your 2 1/1 red mercenaries, but if that's true, you can use them to buff something else and make it into a better attacker. So the efficiency here is awesome. And then, obviously, if you have a deck with a bunch of other outlaws, which isn't that hard to do if you're in red, they're also all going to have haste. So I think this is a bomb. It gives you serious value no matter what happens, and it can really take over games, giving it an A-. Next up, it's Highway Robbery, which for 1 generic and a red is a common sorcery. You may discard a card or sacrifice a land. If you do, draw 2 cards, and it has plot for 1 generic and a red. Tormenting voice type effects have been getting more and more pushed of late, and this one has a couple of things going on that make it pretty nice. First, you can sacrifice a land to it. That's no small thing because normally when you draw this kind of card in top deck mode, you have to wait a turn to cast it because you don't have a card to throw away, and that is brutal. This lets you do it right away. Plus, the whole plot side of things means you can make sure you have the mana to cast your new cards on your next turn, and blue-red likes to cast 2 spells in a turn, giving this a C. Next up, it's Irascible Wolverine, which for 2 generic and a red is a 3/2 at common. When it enters the battlefield, you exile the top card of your library. Until end of turn, you can play that card, and you can plot for 2 generic and a red. So the ideal thing to do here is play this with plot, because that means you'll have all of your mana available when you play it on your next turn. So taking advantage of that card will be easier. And in the late game, you can probably just play it normally and take advantage of the card. You can also just run it out on turn 4 before you've played a land, and if you manage to hit a land, that's nice, and if you don't, that's okay too. So overall, I think it looks like a pretty good card pretty much any way you cast it. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Iron Fist Pulverizer, which for 4 generic and a red is a 4/5 giant warrior at common with reach. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, it deals 2 damage to target opponent, scry 1. I'm not sure this does enough to warrant playing as a 5-drop in a lot of decks. A 4/5 reach is something, and chipping in some extra damage doesn't hurt, but it's also not a card that will really alter the trajectory of the game in a big way, especially because it gets harder to cast 2 spells a game the longer the game goes on and it's a 5-drop. It is a way to commit a crime, but again, red's not that into it. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Longhorn Sharpshooter, which for 2 generic and a red is a Minotaur Rogue at uncommon. It's a 3/3, it's got reach, and when it becomes plotted, it deals 2 damage to any target, and you can plot it for 3 generic and a red. I like this a lot. Plotting it still lets you affect the board, which isn't something you can do with most cards that plot. And if you don't have time for that, you still get a 3 mana 3/3 with reach. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Magda, the Horde Master, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 legendary dwarf berserker at rare. Whenever you commit a crime, you create a tapped treasure token. This ability triggers only once each turn. Sacrifice 3 treasures, create a 4/4 red scorpion dragon creature token with flying and haste. Activate only as a sorcery. So this is a 2-drop that can be a major problem for your opponent without too much trouble. I wouldn't count on getting the dragon all the time or anything, but you'll do it sometimes, and getting treasure in the early game for committing crimes is pretty sweet, giving this a B. Next up, it's Magebane Lizard, which for 1 generic and a red is a 1/4 lizard at uncommon. Whenever a player casts a non-creature spell, it deals damage to that player equal to the number of non-creature spells they've cast this turn. The effect is symmetrical, so keep that in mind. If you have a low number of non-creature spells, you can break that symmetry, and you can also break the symmetry by just being like a really aggressive deck that wants your opponent to take as much damage as possible. Of course, a 2 mana 1/4 is kind of an awkward stat line in an aggressive red deck. It is a bummer that it only counts non-creature spells to some extent because it doesn't really punish plot, because a lot of things with plot are creature spells. This looks pretty medium overall. I don't envision it having a big impact on most games. It has kind of okay stats and a kind of okay ability. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Mind Raider, which for 2 generic and a red is a 3/2 human rogue at common. It's got trample. When it enters the battlefield, if you control another outlaw, you create a treasure token. If this always made a treasure, it'd be a C+. While I think it will make one reasonably often, it's not going to be automatic, and that probably makes it a C. Next up, it's Outlaws Fury, which for 2 generic and a red is a common instant. Creatures you control get +2/+0 until end of turn. If you control an outlaw, exile the top card of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may play that card. Adding draw a card to mass pump spells is pretty good, as we saw in the last set, and this will be able to get you that card reasonably often, as Outlaws are all over the place. Still, it doesn't give a toughness boost, and that certainly hurts it, as your creatures will often still die in combat. Getting that card really offsets that problem a bit, and going wide looks pretty doable in red. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Prickly Pear, which for 2 generic and a red is a 2/2 plant mercenary at common. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 red mercenary creature token. A 3 mana 2/2 that makes a 1/1 always plays well. It's just a good rate, and it works well alongside go wide payoffs. And this 1/1 even comes with some additional upside, which in most formats we get a 3 mana 2/2 that just makes like a random 1/1 that doesn't do anything else. And on top of that, both of these creatures also have outlaw creature types. All of that, I think, makes this a B-. Next up, it's Quick Draw, which for 1 red mana is a common instant. Target creature you control gets +1/+1 and gains first strike until end of turn. Creatures target opponent controls lose first strike and double strike until end of turn. One mana tricks that help a creature win combat most of the time play pretty well in limited. You can just smash through an opposing creature for so little mana with a card like this. Taking first strike away from your opponent might actually come up sometimes too. And this is a way to commit a crime for only 1 red mana. Like, even if you're not targeting your opponent and actually getting anything out of it, if you have a crime payoff, it's going to work out okay. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Quilled Charger, which for 3 generic and a red is a 4/3 Porcupine Mount at common. When it attacks while saddled, it gets +1/+2 and gains menace until end of turn, and it has Saddle 2. This is an intimidating attacker when you saddle it, and pretty darn mediocre when you can't. It's probably a C. Next up, it's Reckless Lackey, which for 1 red mana is a 1/2 Goblin Pirate at common with first strike and haste. For 2 generic and a red, you can sack it and draw a card and create a treasure token. We've come a long way since Raging Goblin. This feels great on turn 1. It's likely to get at least 2 swings in before your opponent can ever block it, and because of first strike, it goes great with combat tricks and any other way to augment it. Then, when you reach the stage of the game where it's kind of irrelevant, you can just throw it away for a card and a treasure. This looks like a quality 1-drop. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Resilient Roadrunner, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 bird at uncommon. It has haste and protection from coyotes, and for 3 generic, it can't be blocked this turn except by creatures with haste. Kind of a fun Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote reference here. A 2-mana 2/2 with haste tends to do a ton of damage when you play it early, and in the late game, the Roadrunner can still find a way to get in with its activated ability, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Return the Favor, which for 2 red mana is an uncommon instant with Spree. For 1 generic, you can copy target instant, spell, sorcery spell, activated ability, or triggered ability. You may choose new targets for the copy, and for 1 generic, you can also change the target of target spell or ability with a single target. This is situational, but these options can be pretty powerful. Redirecting removal pointed at your own stuff or copying your own removal spell is the ideal thing to do with this, and I think those come up often enough for this to be a card you play. You can even do both, copying an opposing removal spell and then changing the target of their first removal spell, and that's going to feel particularly insane. So the ceiling here is really, really high. There are going to be games that are determined by somebody casting this for 4 mana. But it's still reactive enough that I don't think it's like amazing, so I think I'm going to start it at a C+. This is definitely a card where if this situation comes up more than I'm thinking, it's going to be significantly better, but I think it's safe to start it at C+. Next up, it's Rodeo Pyromancers, which for 3 generic and a red is a 3/4 human mercenary at common. Whenever you cast your first spell each turn, add 2 red. The stat line isn't great, but this ability looks like it's going to play pretty well in the format. It works really well with plot, both because you can use the random extra mana you get to help you plot something, and because if you cast a plot spell on your turn, you get 2 red mana, and you have all your other mana available too. You're not always going to be able to use the mana, but I think you'll be able to often enough for this to be a pretty nice 4-drop. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Scalestorm Summoner, which for 2 generic and a red is a 3/3 human warlock at uncommon. When it attacks, create a 3/1 red dinosaur creature token if you control a creature with power 4 or greater. This is quite the payoff for having a 4-power creature. It also counts itself, so if you can put a counter on it and attack with it, it'll make a 3/1. Just getting 1/3/1 out of this feels amazing, and it doesn't seem like that will be ultra challenging, giving this a B-. Next up, it's Scorching Shot, which for 2 red mana is an uncommon sorcery that deals 5 damage to target creature. 2 red mana does mean it isn't always easy to cast this, but it can trade up in a big way because it's so cheap. And it's not like it's a removal spell that's only good in the early game. It'll kill almost everything all game long for a very low amount of mana. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Slick Shot Show Off, which for 2 generic and a red is a 1/2 bird wizard at rare. It's got flying and haste. And whenever you cast a non-creature spell, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn, and it is plot for 1 generic and a red. A 2-mana 1/2 with haste and flying is already pretty decent, and this will often have higher power. The whole plot angle here doesn't seem that great most of the time because in limited, just getting it out there to swing on turn 2 is going to make the most sense. It can help you with some of the synergy in the set, though. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Stingerback Terror, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a 7/7 Scorpion Dragon at rare. It's got flying and trample, and it gets -1/-1 for each card in your hand, and it is plot for 2 generic and a red. In limited, you don't have to try that hard for this to be reasonable. I mean, if you play it on turn 4, it'll probably be a 3/3 or a 4/4, and that's plenty efficient for a creature that will continue to grow. Furthermore, with plot in the format, including on this card, you're likely to have fewer cards in hand than you usually do. Obviously, it doesn't get truly terrifying in most cases until the late game, but it's reasonably efficient on 4 and just gets better from there. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Take for a Ride, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon sorcery. It has flash as long as you've committed a crime this turn. Gain control of target creature until end of turn, untap that creature, it gains haste until end of turn. This is a really good threaten. First, being able to cast it at instant speed is a huge deal. This means you can steal an opposing creature when your opponent attacks and force them to block each other, giving you a 2-for-1. You're not always going to be able to cast it with flash, of course, but the times you do, it can be an absolute beating. Meanwhile, it has all the upside other 3-mana threatens have. They're great in aggro decks and can often end the game, and most importantly, they're good with sacrifice effects where you can steal an opposing creature, attack with it, and sacrifice it for value. While Black-Red isn't entirely into sacrificing in this format, there is enough going on in the color pair for you to be able to sacrifice the thing you steal efficiently. I still think it probably needs a build around, but I think it's a good enough threat and that playing it in any deck isn't a disaster, or at least any aggressive deck isn't a disaster. I think it's probably a C- in most red decks and a B- in a deck where you can either commit crimes really successfully or sacrifice things easily. Next up, it's Terror of the Peaks, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a 5/4 dragon at Mythic Rare. It's got flying. Spells your opponents cast at target Terror of the Peaks cost an additional 3 life to cast. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, Terror of the Peaks deals damage equal to that creature's power to any target. This is a reprint, and there's no reason it won't be a bomb again. It's an efficient flyer, and even if your opponent kills it right away, you come out ahead by a little bit since they get bolted in the face. As soon as you play your first creature with the Terror in play, the game is probably over, and Plot actually increases your chances of pulling that off the turn you play the Terror, so it might be even better this time, giving it an A. Next up, it's Thunder Salvo, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant. It does X damage to target creature, where X is 2, plus the number of other spells you've cast this turn. 2 mana for 2 damage at instant speed is a C, but if you can double spell, something easier in this format thanks to Plot, which I've said a lot in this video, this ends up being a 2 mana deal 3, something that's usually a B. You're not always going to have things line up that way, of course, so I think I have to give it a C+. And our last red card is Trick Shot, which for 4 generic and a red is a common instant. It deals 6 damage to target creature and 2 damage to up to 1 other target creature token. 5 mana for 6 damage at instant speed isn't amazing. It's expensive enough that you're going to have a hard time feeling like this is efficient. But it can kill most stuff, and picking off a token with it seems like relevant text in the format. Because it's an instant, you can occasionally manufacture some blowouts. I kind of don't think you ever want more than one of these, but I think the first copy's probably a C+. So, those are all the red cards in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. Next, I'll be back to talk about all the green cards. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the set review videos that are already out, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.